My name's Stewart Lansley. I'm a visiting fellow at City University, and I've been, writing about and trying to promote the idea of citizens' wealth funds for several years now. A citizens' wealth fund is a new idea. It's a social and economic instrument that could be a central feature in the various attempts to build a much more progressive society. It's an idea that's about building a better future and trying to create a much more inclusive economy. Essentially, a citizens' wealth fund is a bundle of assets, financial and physical, created by the state, but actually owned by all citizens. In that sense, it's a completely new idea. It would operate a little bit like a giant unit trust, but instead of the unit trust being owned by a bunch of individuals or by an individual or by an institution, it will be owned by the people. So this will give people a direct stake in the economy. They will own part of the economy. Initially, quite a small part of the economy, but over time, that part of the economy that they own will grow to reach something like a tenth or maybe even a fifth of the size of the economy. I mean, essentially, we've been looking at how you would implement a citizens' wealth fund. So it's been quite a pragmatic project. It's really about how you translate this concept into a real life model. Could you actually implement it? Could it work? We're looking at the plumbing, if you like, the plumbing of how this, paper concept could actually work in practice. So we've looked at global examples of how other countries have implemented similar sorts of models, although what we're proposing is very different from most of these models. It's quite a different, unique kind of concept. And then we've been trying to work out how you'd finance it, how it would work in practice, how you'd run it, how you'd manage it, how you'd design it, and over what kind of time, how long would it take before it could be implemented. So it's been, we looked at international examples, try to learn the lessons of other countries, but also try to work out the practical issues of how it could work in practice.
I'm Steve Schifferes, Director of the Social Wealth Fund Project for the Friends Provident Foundation. I'm also a Professor of Financial Journalism at City University, just retired. Our proposal is to create two sorts of citizens' wealth funds. The first one, which we'll be talking about in a bit, is a financial fund. This is essentially a large mutual fund owned by the people and which will be held and run under professional management, but will be used for the benefit of all. So this is what we call our next generation funds. Separately, we're also proposing what we're calling an urban land trust. And this is a fund that's designed to take advantage of the fact that we, the people, through the government, already own about £1 trillion worth of public land. We want to find a way of using that for the public good, and in particular, to ensure that we produce more housing at a reasonable cost and more public housing as well. There are three different aspects of this I think it would be useful to talk about. First of all, there's the question of how you would fund this, and I'll deal with that first. Secondly, there's the question of how the fund would be invested and how it would grow. And then the third question is, what would we take out of the fund and what would we do with the proceeds? So how would it benefit people? So if I start first with where the money comes for this fund, it would have to come from taxes because, unfortunately, we've spent all the North Sea oil wealth and we've also spent all our privatization proceeds. Many other funds that have been set up in other countries have the advantage that they either have taken the oil funds, for example in Norway, or they've taken privatization proceeds, as in the case of Australia, and used those to kickstart their fund. We won't have that advantage. We may be able to borrow a bit of money to start it, but essentially it's a way of compulsory saving. So we're asking people through the tax system to spend a bit less and put a bit more aside for the future. Our aim is to build up a very large fund that would be something like £1 trillion in 10 years, £2 trillion in 20 years, and £4 trillion in 30 years. Now to do that, we're going to have to devote a considerable amount of money to flow into this fund. And to get a fund that size, we're probably talking about £50 billion a year being put into this fund from various sources. Our view, I think generally, is that that should be split among a kind of national insurance tax that everyone will contribute to in return for the benefits they're going to get. But separately, because part of what we're looking at is how to redistribute wealth, additional wealth taxes which will capture some of the gains that rich people have made, and because we now have a very unequal system of wealth, and wealth is very lightly taxed. So we want to also increase wealth taxes on people who can afford to pay. And thirdly, we want to look at corporate taxation as well and see if there's a way that we can change the way corporations are taxed and perhaps regulate in the stock market in order to make sure they also make a contribution. So they would be the three sources of funds that would get to this 50 billion. And obviously we need to look at how that would be divided, but assumption it would be that each of those three categories would make a substantial portion of the money going into this fund.
The way the fund would work is that it would be a permanent fund, so it would continue to grow, and the fund would pay out a maximum of, say, 4% a year. So we're assuming that it would achieve a decent rate of return, probably in excess of 4%, and it would pay out 4%. So a fund of £1 trillion would pay out £40 billion a year. A fund of £2 trillion would pay out £80 billion a year. There are three basic options for using the proceeds. One is to fund increase of investment. Secondly, you could fund cash payments, increases in cash payments. And thirdly, you could fund an extension of, say, universal services, for example, extending social care, making social care for the over 65s free at the point of use. Our preference is to use it for cash payments. And a fund of that sort of size could, within 15 years, pay an annual dividend to everybody of around £800 a year. But after another 10 years, that's a single generation, there would be enough money to pay a modest universal basic income. In other words, everybody would get a weekly income at a modest level. So this approach would enable us to settle the debate about how you fund a universal basic income. And this, of course, is quite controversial because many of the critics of universal basic income say it's unaffordable.
Hi, I'm Duncan McCann. I'm a research fellow at City University. So the second part of our proposal around social wealth funds is to create urban or regional land trusts. The reason we came up with this proposal was because as we looked into what the public sector currently owns, what's actually on the asset side of the balance sheet of the public sector, what was clear was that land was one of the biggest assets that we still own, despite the years of selling public land and the right to buy council house sales that have been going on since the late 70s. And we really wanted to try and understand how this land could be put to better use. There are many difficulties with the public land estate, mainly that it's spread out over many hundreds of different organisations with all the different central government departments, but local authorities, and also public bodies like the NHS, the fire brigade, the police, all individually owning land. And we really thought that there was a huge potential in amalgamating this land together, but not nationally, but keeping it regional so that the needs of the local community could really be met by this public land. So initially, we would want to transfer all public land into the trust schemes. And the trusts would then have a principal goal of resolving the housing crisis within their particular region. The first benefit would be really an immediate building project that would build the next generation of social housing that we so desperately need. Since the advent of the Right to Buy programme, we've sold 2 million social houses and replaced hardly any of them. We desperately need a new stock of housing that is going to meet the demands of the future. So that's definitely the first thing that people would notice. The second thing would be that when, at the moment, when public land is released, it's merely sold to private developers, and then the public has no further say, other than through the planning system, as to exactly what is built on that land, how it is rented, and so on. So as well as building, they would have much more control under the lease system that we propose for public land. So rather than selling it and losing all control, apart from the planning system controls that you can put in place, it would be much more able to dictate what kind of development happened, potentially even putting covenants around rent increases, tenure structures, things like that. So a lot more power in the way that public land would be used, and again, benefiting the common person. And then the third one is that over time, the amount of land that is publicly owned for the common good would grow. And again, that would lead to a whole set of kind of macroeconomic benefits, as the economic rent of land wasn't concentrated in such a small ownership group.